Good evening, Lake Orion. Welcome to History Now here on ONTV. I'm your host, Anthony Taormina. I want to talk to you guys about something that is very, very dear to my heart, which is the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars. I know a lot of you guys have heard me talk about World War II, and there is connections between the time period from 1793 to 1815 and the 1939 to 1945, or you can make the World War I periods as well, adding that to the World War II periods. I want to talk about the question that I ask, that a lot of historians ask, is are the French Revolutionary Wars and also the Napoleonic Wars, are they linked? The reason why that I ask that is France undergoes a period of change during this time period. Prior to 1790, the 1791 through 1815 time period, France is going through a lot of internal struggle. 1789, France, prior to 1789, France was a divine right monarchy led by King Louis XVI. There was several uprisings that occurred in France. The storming of the Bastille, the Tuileries Palace, Napoleon, or no, not Napoleon, but the king attempts to flee Paris. There was Abbey-Siege, what is the third estate. There was struggle with representation, issues with taxes that was going on in France. They were experiencing one of the worst harvests during the 1780s, but that's for a discussion for another time. I want to talk about the wars and how it played out. You have to look at 1791. During that time period, France was undergoing changes, which the divine right monarchy, then they were constitutional monarchy, they would become a republic, then they'd become ruled by a directory. And then also during that republic, they also became a dictatorship. Then they had a directory. Then they had an empire until they became a constitutional monarchy again after the overthrow of Napoleon back in 1815. It's important to know that Austria and Prussia, particularly Austria, the brother, was related to Marie Antoinette, and Marie Antoinette herself was an Austrian. Austria enlisted the support of Prussia, and they were enlisting pressure on France to basically not do any harm to the king and the queen. Now, as I mentioned, King Louis and his wife ended up fleeing France, or trying to flee France, heading to Austria, but was caught, and eventually the family was returned to Paris. Now, there was a lot of fear that the king was sabotaging his country, that he was allowing the Austrians and the Prussians to come into France, to invade France. So as a result, France under the National Assembly declared war on Austria and Prussia. The king at first applauded this because he wanted to be seen as supporting the French cause. However, behind the scenes, I think he was pushing for invasion, because one of the conditions that the Austrians, especially the Austrians, was pushing for was the restoration of the king and queen back to the throne, that France would return to a divine right monarchy. And the majority of the French people, especially those who were non-noble or non-clergy, wanted to see France ended up eventually becoming a constitutional monarchy, but then there was also calls for abolishing the monarchy altogether. So in 1792, the French people abolished the monarchy, and as a result, the king was imprisoned. Austria and Prussia were threatening to, if anything bad happened to the king, that he would be sentenced, or that they would invade. So France executed the king in January 1793. As a result, Britain, Spain, Portugal, Russia all declare war on France. So France is ending up in a war against all of Europe. France was moving to invade the Netherlands. They were moving to invade Belgium, which was a part of the Netherlands. But also France was involved in a civil war between those who abolished the monarchy, who support abolishing the monarchy, and those who were wanting to retain the monarchy. So loyalists versus either the Jacobins or the rebels of France. So they ended up going to war, and France didn't have an army. They really did not have an army. The generals and the generals at the time were supported by the clerk, were of noble stature. There wasn't really soldiers that were in big positions amongst the so-called Third Estate, which at that time was not being called that anymore. They were the quote the so-called people of France. So as a result, Austria and Prussia ended up going into France. There was massive panic, especially in Paris. There was fears that there would be revenge for what was happening. The government was executing supporters of the loyalists. And as a result, there was mass chaos, anarchy arose, especially in Paris. And the Committee of Public Safety, as the main head of government was called, led by the major figure of this was Maximilien Robespierre. Now, Robespierre was somebody that he believed in the cause. But he would eventually become so paranoid that he would eventually turn on his own allies amongst the Committee of Public Safety, including another prominent member, Danton, who really spoke about wanting change in France, wanting liberty in France. So Robespierre followed Danton, but eventually would turn on Danton and the Girondists parties, and that's something I'll talk about when I go into the French Revolution in time. But Austria and Prussia were threatening to invade France. Also, the government was going through a civil war with loyalists, which would continuously happen until 1815. So it led to the result of the Battle of Valmy in September 20th, 1792. This was seen as a turning point for the French people. At the time, the King Louis was still alive, but the French were able to repel the Austrians and the Prussians back out of France during this Battle of Valmy. And as a result, it gave confidence to the French public that, hey, we can fight against Austria and Prussia, and we can fight against Europe. At this time, Europe was under a monarchy. Most of the states were under monarchies at that time, and France was the only republic. So this could be seen as a fight between the monarchy and the republic, because at the time the republic was not seen in France as a event. It was not done. But France based the model on the United States model of no king. There was simply a president. So it was quite an experience for France to go through during this time. When we come back to history now, we're going to talk about, was it seen as a world war? Because there was outside of Europe, there was a lot of fighting going on in other events, and also the United States. What was the United States' view of the French Revolution? Here on History Now on ONTV.
We own a Habitat home.
I love working on my Habitat home.
Soy dueño de una casa de Habitat.
My neighbor is a Habitat homeowner.
Being a Habitat homeowner has changed our lives.
My mortgage payment for Habitat is less than what I paid for rent.
Habitat for Humanity of Oakland County currently has homes available with mortgage payments lower than most rent payments. If you or someone you know needs decent and affordable housing, call 248-338-1843 or visit our website at habitatoakland.org.
Welcome back to History Now here on ONTV. Well, I want to talk about another question that gets asked with me is, was the French Revolutionary Wars seen as a world war? It's very, very difficult to examine what was a world war. I often get asked, was it seen as a world war during the American Revolution? And I tend to say yes, it was a world war, because there was fighting going on not just in the Americas, but also in Europe, in Africa, in Asia. So, I mean, it was seen as a world war. There was also events going on in Saint-Domingue, in the Caribbean, Haiti, present-day Haiti, and then also Egypt. I'm gonna go over the Haitian Revolution briefly. At this time, the French was encouraging African American groups that were living in, particularly areas that were occupied by the British and the Spanish, to rise up against their occupiers. And during that time, they were encouraging them to fight, and there was a Haitian who ended up fighting for the French cause, ended up wanting independence in the present-day Dominican Republic, and ended up fighting against the British and the Spanish, who were both there occupying Hispaniola, but the French were also occupying an area called Haiti. So they ended up fighting and expelling the British and the Spanish out of those areas, but eventually the French end up having a different kind of heart towards those who were living in the Caribbean area. There was a feeling of resentment. There was a feeling of, look, we did this for you, now you do this for us. So it ended up becoming the Haitian Revolution, which I'll probably go over another time. But it was very important because back during 1801, 1802, 1803, it was very important because France was looking for a way to get into the Americas again. France was at that time in control of Louisiana. There was also riches that were in the Caribbean, particularly tobacco, copper. And France was very, very much involved in the world trade that was going on throughout the world and with its colonies. And France wanted to keep that. I also got to mention sugar as well. So France was very much involved in that, just like Britain, just like Spain was, but it ended up becoming a war to expel the French from the island. And they were successful at being able to expel the French from the island. France ended up suing for peace, and Haiti ended up gaining its independence in 1801, 1802, 1803. And the event was seen as a large failure in France because the French were trying to encourage those who were living in the colonies to rebel against their masters, but the French ended up becoming colonial masters themselves, and they ended up having to be taken out. And Napoleon, who we'll go over later on during the Napoleonic Wars, wanted to really, really have an influence in the French colonies. Because one thing that doesn't get mentioned very much was what was going on in Louisiana during the French Revolutionary Revolution and the Revolutionary Wars. Also, the French Revolution was a point of topic in the United States. As this book, Gordon Wood's Empire of Liberty, was to point out, the public opinion was divided in the United States about who to support. Guys like Thomas Jefferson, guys like John guys like Alexander Hamilton, guys like Aaron Burr, John Adams. All of them had support in terms of who to support during the war. Now, Britain and France at this time was fighting for influence in American politics. The United States had a treaty that existed with France called the Treaty of Alliance from 1778. With the monarchy, the French expected the Americans to honor this. There were those like Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, that were pushing for better relations with Great Britain based on trade. And it resulted in 1795 to a treaty, Jay's Treaty with Great Britain, which was seen as a success, especially for Alexander Hamilton, who favored the British over the French. There was a lot of concern at that time that the French in the United States being radicalized. We didn't bring up the Jacobins earlier, but there was an attempted. There was fears that the Jacobins would come in. There was a lot of fears of the guillotine. There was also, the American public was divided over who to support. At the end of the day, the United States, led by George Washington, had to play a, quote, neutral hand. Although he leaned towards the British somewhat, he had to play an even Stephen Neal because the British and the French were both taking over American ships. They were preventing trade from the United States, and it was just a complete mess. So then there was also a brief quasi-war that occurred between the United States and the French from 1798 and 1799, in which the French were continuing to take over American ships and without reparation, and the United States ended up intervening because at that time the United States and Britain had signed the Jay's Treaty, which basically Britain stopped scuttling American ships at that time. Even though Britain would violate this for the later War of 1812, but excuse me, the Americans and the French had a brief quasi-war a brief naval war after the XYZ affair, which the French were bribing the Americans, that the French were not allowing the Americans to see their representatives. So it was a brief quasi-war, but that got resolved in 1800 after France requested that it be treated the same as Britain. So there was resentment driven against both sides, France and Britain, especially in terms of trade in the United States. But overall, the government was divided between supporting the British or supporting the French. Thomas Jefferson was a big-time proponent of supporting the French. So it caused a lot of division, and even caused the political parties. The Federalist Party, which supported Britain, and then the Republican Democratic Party that supported France. Well, when we come back to History Now, we're going to discuss in 1795, France gains the initiative in Europe, here on History Now on ONTV. Hello, Lake Orion and Oakland County. This is Anthony Taormina here, talking a new show here called OA Now. We're going to talk about sports from football to basketball to volleyball to track and field to soccer, cross country, etc. here on OA Now on ONTV. Welcome back to History Now here on ONTV. Well, I want to talk about the 1795 to 1801 time period. In 1794, 1795, we have the executions of Robespierre, members of the Committee of Public Safety, the Thermidor, but also something goes on with the French army. Prior to Valmy, France was being manhandled by Austria and Prussia. But by 1794, 1795, France regains the initiative. France ends up handling Austria and Prussia. Britain refuses to fight on land. They mostly prefer to fight on the naval side of things because Britain had the most powerful navy in the world. There was the Battle of Toulon that occurred in 1794 between Britain and Spain against France. So as a result, the French army was successful in repelling that invasion. Also, there was focus also on the coalition. Russia, Sweden, Austria, and Prussia were also focusing on a different movement going on in Poland, which sympathized with Republican France. So Russia, Sweden, Austria, and Prussia were all focused on the partition of Poland. So they weren't fully focused, wholly engaged on France like they should have been. So as a result, in 1795, Prussia and Spain, in separate peace treaties with France, they sue for peace. Prussia ends up getting out of the war. They prefer to focus on Poland, what was going on there. Spain, obviously after the Battle of Toulon, there were several battles on the prairies between Spanish and French troops. France was manhandling Spain, so Spain sued for peace, and actually Spain ended up siding with France against the British, who was also using their naval experiences. We had talked about what was going on in the Caribbean. So Britain and Spain were now fighting each other as well. France was pushing Austria back. France was taking areas in Germany. The Netherlands fell to the French. So the French were starting to regain the initiative by the time in 1794, 1795. And it got to the point where fighting stopped. And in 1802, there was a brief peace. There was a brief peace between Britain and France called the Peace of Amiens. One thing that I didn't mention was the fighting in Egypt. Napoleon, then at that point, was a general. He was fighting in Italy, fighting against numerous states in Italy, and also he was fighting in Egypt. And Napoleon took down the British in Egypt. So he was widely seen as a hero in France because he ended up standing up to the British in Egypt and defeated them in Egypt, preventing a takeover on France's southern flank and also in Italy. So Napoleon at this point was very popular. So by the time the Peace of Amiens took place between Britain and France, there was a brief time of peace in Europe for about 14 months. So for 14 months, there was peace in Europe, in which at that time, Britain and France, both sides could regain the initiative. Britain was looking to form another coalition against France that consisted of Austria, Prussia, hopefully Russia, against France. There was issues in the Americas that had to be taken care of. Louisiana, which France was hoping to have, France was hoping to use it against the British, but ended up selling that land to the United States. There was the Haitian Revolution that was going on in Haiti, which ended up being a big setback for French interests in the Americas and the Caribbean. And but they needed the time and the money to fund for another war in Europe. Nothing was truly settled. But for the French, this was a positive because they were able to establish an empire, beginnings of an empire, but they took land. They had a Republican movement in Poland. They were able to take down Austria, Prussia, Spain. Spain became an ally to France. Prussia was held off for the time being. There was focus on Poland. Russia's and Sweden's heart was not fully into it. Austria's heart was not into it as much. So there was for 1802 there was the Peace of Amiens that took place. Until then, there was to be peace for 14 months until 1803 when we talk about the Napoleonic Wars. Well, I'm going to conclude this week's episode of History Now. For the next part and the next chapter, I'm going to talk about the Napoleonic Wars. So have a good night, History Now, and see you soon.